Hello everyone and welcome to another VOD review. We have a special guest for this one. We have Spilo from the London Spitfire, well, ex-London Spitfire. You were just a coach with them recently, unfortunately got released. You want to introduce yourself to anyone who might not know who you are?
Yeah. I mean, I'm Spilo from the London Spitfire. I've been into Overwatch coaching for quite a long time and been into coaching in general quite a long time before that. Had a great time working with London. Yeah, as crazy as it seems, I had a great time working with the boys last season. Finished it up the second half of the season, managed to pull off a win, and overall was a really great positive and learning experience. And then obviously this season, getting to work with Chris, getting to work with Commander X, and just obviously the results that we had. I think like overall phenomenal learning experience. Budget mode hits. Losing the job sucks, but overall, what an amazing experience. And super into content creation and super into coaching. And I really, really enjoy talking about Overwatch. So hoping to provide some insight and inside resource on, I guess, the meta, the teams, the league, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to picking your brain. I guess I kind of want to start here with like the London Spitfire, so this is a team that, as you said, last year, we don't talk about last year as much for that team. Obviously, like you had some good pieces, but, you're still waiting for Sparker to come of age, didn't really get the wins. How did this transformation happen, right? Because you guys are now, London's like 11-7 or something like that now. They've just qualified for the Toronto LAN. Like, how did you guys turn the team around considering you didn't change that many players?
It's all about like the ingredients. I think even maybe ingredients isn't the right word because there's such big pieces, technically ingredients. Because if you think about, like you said, you had a lot of the good pieces, they had success in contenders, but then you actually apply that in a league where everybody's on 130 ping, 140 ping, Rippo's even higher. Nobody's in person training together like all of these over. I think that's such an important aspect as well as building that camaraderie, building that synergy by being in the team in person. Everybody's in different places, in different states, in a different coaching staff, in a different situation. The other thing people have to understand about Overwatch is like, oh man, Ash is looking fly.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
I love that bug so much. It's like the Lucio, the like his net connects to the map and just like stretches all over the place.
Yeah.
If it doesn't start really well in that circumstance, I think the rest of the season is just inevitably going to be poor because it's hard when things are that negative, the extenuating circumstances are that negative. It's just a downward spiral, right? And I come on, Sparker comes on about the same time, a little bit past the midway point of the season. And we definitely were playing better, but it was never quite enough, right? We were always played our best game against the Shock. Well, guess what? We go down to the map 5 last round, we lose one team fight and we lose. So everybody writes it off as a loss. And the same thing happens versus Toronto Defiant. We lose to nothing map 4. Same thing happened to the Dallas Fuel. In fact, we should have beaten the Dallas Fuel, but it's still a loss, right? A loss is a loss. And that hurts your confidence, right? So it's like those games over and over and over again. And then it becomes a situation where players aren't motivated and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. It just kind of like compounds itself. A little bit of a hot take here, but I think like the Vancouver game, even at that point in time, like everyone's excited for the win. But that was actually some of the worst Overwatch we played all season. Like
that was a game. I will say like you guys definitely had played better than that day.
It was a 3-0 the scrims versus Vancouver, that version of Vancouver were so easy. It was often we ended up blacklisting them as the London Spitfire last season. But we go into that season and it goes into, or that game and it goes into a map 5. It just goes to show like it is so hard. It's like running with ankle weights, and every single game that you lose, the confidence gets lower. You had a couple of kilos to the ankles, and it just gets worse. So, what it did though is it built like I guess a lot of strength of character for the players that we did keep around. Obviously, it built a lot of strength of character for me. I built a lot of strength of character for Hottie. I built a lot of strength of character for Sparker, and I think you're seeing the results of that investment this season.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see like a bunch of these players. Like Hottie is obviously a very highly talked about player this season, but after last season, people were like very critical of him, and like he did struggle to have a season, and
he did.
The fact that you guys were able to sort of pull him back from that as a team, pull in all these players was absolutely awesome. So I think I'm going to start the VOD in a second, and I want to start, as we start, obviously we don't need to talk about the gameplay as much, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts about like the meta, right? Because that is obviously the big thing that has happened so far throughout the this tournament. We got the Junker Queen. It's created like, how did this meta start? Because all the out players, I assume you guys saw what was happening in contenders first, and then you were like, did everyone just start playing that off the bat to see, or were people trying to iterate, do different things, and then everyone came to the same consensus that Junker Queen was next?
Yeah, well, it isn't like a new thing in Overwatch League to just straight up copy from contenders because it's easy. But
Yeah.
like Overwatch meta has always revolved around like mobility and taking angles and DPS playing from different positions. But we now have a composition that even if you were to play a super spammy comp like a Pharmacy, a Tracer, Sombra, Genji, whatever, Hanzo, there's too much sustain and too much speed for those DPS angles to really matter whatsoever.
Yeah.
And teams did test. Like, I don't want to say that no Overwatch League team gave it due diligence. A lot did. Some of the teams that we were scrimming playing some Pharah. I know, for example, Dallas tried Winston double flex support, similar to what Florida was trying on Gibraltar a few times versus us. Yeah, they tried that in scrims. Did not go well. So that's the risk, though. Is there a comp that counters Junker Queen? Yes. Is there a comp that could have countered Goats? Maybe, probably not. But it's the amount of return on investment, and then if it doesn't pay off, you're screwed, right? And that's the real catch.
And it's also like the idea that, like, as you said, even if it does work, like the value of, like, as you said, maybe there is a comp on Gibraltar that is better than this Junker Queen Jotes meta, right?
Right.
You're better off just practicing Jotes on every single map, applying it across every single map, and then if that means you're better at it across the board compared to just being able to win that one map. And like, did you see anyone else, like, other than Florida after that really like commit to, like, let's say Pharah, right? Like, a lot of people thought that Pharah might be the counter, but that was really the contenders like Pharah bug that existed that allowed that.
Right, exactly. And we did see teams early on trying Pharah, but even early on when teams were not that good at Jotes, they were still able to consistently beat the Pharah comps. And you could make the argument that those teams weren't that good at Pharah either, but again, it's about the return on the investment. And it was a bit ironic for me to be saying this, considering we're the team that like played so much Rhine and Winston metas, played so much Rhine and Zarya metas. But I think the difference is that, like, when we initially tried Rhine, we were on comfort heroes. Those are heroes were good for us. And to be honest with you, the Rhine comp wasn't that good, but Rhine was. And Rhine could do a lot of things that allowed the comp to work. When you're playing these other comps, I just don't think that there's a lot of heroes that can really stand out and like carry the fights in the way that we were able to make things work. And also those are all comfort heroes for us, right? I don't think a lot of teams are going to have like a Pharah one trick, right? That's going to just make it work. We are all on comfort hits. The thing that you'd have to do to counter Jotes would mean that most players are on weird heroes, and that just is never going to work.
Yeah, it's just too hard. Going back to like the Reinhardt of like the previous stages, is that like Hardy being like, I think this will work, or is this like a collaboration within the team being like, I think this can work, or how did that come to be?
It's actually really a collaboration. Like, this is something that like we as coaches and all the players are kind of involved in talking about, like what feels good. I think early on there was a decent amount of Reinhardt being played from like several teams. I think Paris was playing some Reinhardt. I want to say even Dallas was playing some Reinhardt. Houston would bring out the Rhine every now and again. Teams felt like Reinhardt was strong in Overwatch 2, and they were right. But there was obviously no team besides us that was willing to give it due diligence. And I could be honest with you, there were definitely times where we as coaches are like, maybe this just isn't gonna work. Like, you know, we have a bad script versus Shock. You know, we're 0-6 in maps from like we're just getting rolled by double flex support. But like we really believe that like we could make it work when it counted, and ultimately we did. And heck, you know, even in times where the Reinhardt just wasn't gonna work, right? The hard double flex support meta towards the end of the Hawaii is like we got to breed out the bone back. Like we even we could not make the make work on mini maps. But you know, that's where like good team fundamentals pays off, because even if you got to put Backbone and Zen, he was actually a pretty decent Zen. He wasn't terrible.
He did well,
but the team play carries us right there. Like their communication was just on a different level than I think a lot of teams. And even though the result for Hawaii wasn't amazing, we were relatively pleased with their performance in that meta. And I will say, there were times in scrims, and this is no joke, where we would beat Shock and double flex support meta in scrims. We'd go like 4-2. Not every time, not even most of the time, but occasionally. And those were always, that was a good feeling.
It was funny. I actually remember being in at the kickoff clash in Dallas, and I was talking to Danny, and Danny comes in. He's like, I was just talking to the Korean players, and they were telling me that like London is like really good right now. I'm like, London? They're like, yeah, they're legit right now, and it's like, holy shit. And going into this stage, because you know you just said like at some point you got to put your foot down and be like, hey, maybe this isn't gonna work. Is that what you guys? In your first match against the Florida Mayhem of this stage, you guys did pull out the Reinhardt, the May on Colosseo. Was that a moment of like you got rolled and you're like, okay, guys, time to hang this one up?
Yeah, and I don't think I'm leaking too much here by saying that, like, when it comes to Colosseo, we're just pretty confident that Reinhardt was good on that map.
Yeah.
But we did have practice on Junker Queen on that map as well. At that point in time, and this is going to kind of segue into what I want to talk about with this meta and why it was such a dice roll earlier on, is like so much of it is mentality, so much of it is like confidence, especially earlier on. We were a team that I feel like, if I do say so myself, a little bit of back padding here, but I felt like we had a really strong grasp of the meta, the way the DPS angles, the timing, the old economy. We had a huge jump on that compared to I think most teams. But what we realized is that we almost overcoached. What happened is I think we moved too fast and started talking about like the really nuances of positioning and like trying to treat it like goats, but we just still weren't always on the same target, on the same timing, and we were still struggling with like being on the same page, right?
Yeah.
And so when you start getting ahead of yourself, the details like just don't matter anymore. And so what ended up happening in that Florida game is like we just played like crap. We just were we just were a horrible team. Like the level of play was just so incredibly low there. And so we go into Colosseo, and I think Frisco's we know Ryan works here. We have a lot of experience playing Ryan here. We're playing horribly in the mirror. We have to throw in a wild card. And obviously it doesn't end up working out, but I think that probably made the most sense given how we were playing in the mirror on that day.
Yeah, no, I get that. So let's break down this Junker Queen meta. So like,
sure.
Talk to me from like a coach's perspective and a player's perspective, because obviously like we, as the desk and like casters and that kind of stuff, we're analyzing at a very surface level of like the Genji needs to get out of the blades, defensive ultimates, making sure you're cycling correctly. What are the things that most people are missing? What are the important pieces that like really dictate who is the better team in this meta?
Sure. And you can even see it actually just in this fight like we're seeing there is like this neutral goes really poorly for us, and it's really not complicated. Obviously, crossing a choke is bad, but the first thing that stands out to me right there, actually, I haven't even seen this game. I saw the result. I was out of town. But the first thing that stands out to me is that Backbone actually dashes out when Hottie goes in. And that's something that I've been saying in my stream over and over again when people ask about Jotes. It's hive mind. It's hive mind. It's everybody's on the same page, on the same time, pushing in, clearing an angle. Even if you're not even like actually pushing, if you're just pressuring, if you're just shooting, everybody has to be on the same timing and preferably on the same target. And what ends up happening is a lot of these teams, even good teams like Glad's early in the meta, mechanically, right? Maybe Reiner wasn't performing up to snuff on Junker Queen, but like mechanically they got skewed, right? They've got a funny Astro, they've got Kevster. There's no weak points there. But what was happening is their timing was just not good. They're on different pages, they're on different timing. The main tank's in, the DPS are not in, the supports are in, and the DPS are out, And that's what's happening, is a lot of teams, this meta is so punishing if you're not all engaged all in the same time or all out all in the same time, because this meta has so many like push pull tools, right? Think about your amp speed, your shout, your Genji dash, your dynamite, your surgeon. All of these are engaged tools, or disengaged tools, right? They could do either way. But if you mess that up, you're cooked. Like you're really cooked. There's absolutely nothing you can do. If your Junker Queen is isolated, she's cooked. She's done. Like and that's where a lot of fights are just won and lost off of that, and really, really nothing else.
Is that what you attribute to the Dallas Fuel success? Like, we always talk about them with their hive mind. They have always been the team that like just fundamentally works on the same level.
100%. I mean, it easily, like you look at that team, and obviously they have Hanbin, who's just playing on another level, and even Edison, somebody who you wouldn't necessarily say is a strong point, but the guy looked insane in Ashe. But I think the majority of their success, it's the hive mind. They are consistently, anything that involves the Lucio speed, anything that involves in and out, they will perform at an S tier level at it consistently all the time. And that is, I think, the difference maker for that team for sure.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So the thing that enabled the Jotes is the commanding shout from Junker Queen, right? Like that is like the big thing. So I've sort of like theorized this myself of like the back and forth, like when do you think is the right time? Like, should you be engaging with the shout to give you initiative to try and isolate someone? Are you wanting to play it reactively? Are you wanting to just use it as much as humanly possible? Like, where did you guys come to the line is?
I'm gonna break it down to like two levels of understanding. So like then this is the initial level of understanding people are still figuring out. The most important thing is, okay, like maybe we're just all gonna always play first tempo. Okay, so like let's just make sure that whenever we're playing, engaging with shout, we're going 3, 2, 1, and like everybody's in at the same time using their cooldowns in the best way possible. And I think that's kind of where the evolution started, right? Okay, we're going to go in with our shout, but we're going to make sure that when Hottie's in, Admiral's in, Sparker's got his aggressive E, Backbone is he's got a good angle for pressuring backline, and if we're going to use our ults, the same kind of thing. We're going to use one ult, they're going to match with another ult, but we know that we're staying because we have that second ult that can layer on top of their ult to win. And I think that's like the first understanding. But the way like Overwatch always evolves, even in a meta like this, which feels very brawl and gross and grindy meta. I think back to GOAT's meta, right?
Yeah.
The way it always evolves at the higher level is people get better at not only learning how to use their cooldowns better and more efficiently, but they learn how to position better. And so what ends up happening is, and you'll see this, like especially with a team like a Toronto or a Dallas, is they learn how to take angles better. They learn how putting my Genji on a high ground, learn how using my Ashe on a flank, using my Sojourn on a flank, even splitting my backline sometimes, not always, but sometimes creates something that a great coach that I'm a big fan of, Egoist Cat, and he talks about something called passive advantage. And what ends up happening is a team that has better DPS positions ends up, if neither team uses shout, the team with the better DPS position is slowly going to bleed you dry, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to use shout just to survive. And that's what ends up happening is the teams get a shout advantage, not because they shouted first or they shouted second. No. It's the positions and cooldown use that they had that forced the other team to have to use shout. Otherwise, they would have just lost. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Okay.
So I paused here because I'm actually curious if that, like what you're talking about, is relative to here, because this is actually a hold that I've seen London do that no one else has really done. You guys actually position Backbone and he steps up to this thing. Is that like intentionally to do what you're saying of like you're giving him this superior positioning so that they have to use shout earlier to try and deal with him and then you can react to that?
Right. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure like exactly what the intention of this hold is, but like theoretically we could see this hold as being Backbone is in a position to where he can do more spam damage to their Queen or to their Ashe. So if he's able to do more spam damage, well then guess what? We're going to win the neutral, or they're going to have to use shout defensively, and then we can shout on top of that. And this particular spot, that's a little bit odd. This might be due to some scouting that they might have had on Toronto, like how they rotate. So, I mean, it worked okay, but yeah.
Okay, that actually triggered an interesting thought because we actually talked about this on Plat Chat today. Like at London Spitfire, how much do you guys do in terms of preparation for individual teams? Of like, because I was when I was a player in a team, I had different levels of preparation for different teams that I played for. Like some teams were like, it's more about focusing on us and playing our fundamentals right, compared to we need to look at how they play and how to isolate and use our strategy to undermine theirs. Like how much did London Spitfire do both of those?
I think we were definitely on the far end of the spectrum when it comes to preparation. I think especially when you have a scout who's as like talented and as skilled as Commander X is, like you're a fool not to use your scouting information. He's really good at it with stats and everything. But I think even us, who I think probably scout more than probably any team in the league, scouts less than people think. I mean, we're talking maybe an hour VOD review, maybe 45 minutes of discussion tops over the course of an entire week for an opponent. Because like what you said, it really is, it's more about the big stuff. All right, we probably think they might do this rotate, or they definitely seem to be a little bit impatient with this ultimate, but you can't, it's just impossible in Overwatch to go into the nitty gritty. It's not like, you know, footballer, like where you can tell like their tendencies when it comes to, you know, corner kicking, or it's not like any other sport where you can know what play they're running. It's more about very big tendencies and then focusing on your own gameplay, like after that, I guess.
So to sort of explain that to like the average viewer. So
Sure.
less so about like, hey, when they come to this corner, they tend to, you know, these players tend to go over here, blah, blah, blah. Is it more about like, although when he plays Genji, here's multiple examples of him exposing himself by going too aggressive in this kind of situation?
Exactly.
Is that it?
Yes, exactly. Or especially if we know the map specific they're going to play, like that. Like I said, there might be specific scouting if we've seen them play an official that they really like this rotate on this map. And that's about as specific as it gets. Outside of that, it's very general, basic stuff. Because I think in the middle of a match, video games are like just esports in general is just unbelievably mentally engaging, and you can't be engaged in your own play. And like the three little details or tendencies, it's just not possible. Like we're not AI, sadly. So, you know.
Yeah, because I remember when I was on the Valiant, actually, when I was like first joining that team, we actually had Damon come in. He used to be a coach for that team, and he did the same thing of like, the problem that we had was when he first started doing them, he was just overwhelming us with information.
Yes.
He's just like, he's just like, we are in like an hour debrief of him talking about all the little things about all the teams do. And then we would come out of that and like, I would look across at like halfway through and Kariv's just like, lying down, like eyes closed and stuff like that. Like people just don't have the ability to absorb that level of information, right? Like, and then apply it in the game. So it's interesting to sort of see if that, like, that's sort of the interesting consensus that you guys came to as well.
Yeah, there's just a big gap between knowledge and skill, right? If you can have, even if you were able to maintain focus during an entire review like that, you're just not going to be able to actually apply it. So then the result is almost meaningless. And I think that's like the really careful line that we had to tread throughout the season, because Chris, X, and myself we're super intense, passionate coaches, but players have to be able to understand and process it and really come up with stuff on their own too. Otherwise, it's just like you've done a lot of work, but it's really meant nothing, right? The return isn't there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, okay, I want to talk about the macro of Jotes a little bit with the support ults. Like, what do you think the way support ults are going to be used? Because, like, it feels like right now, like, at first, people were trying to save the beat for Rampage, but it actually feels like it's moved away from that a little bit, that people are using the beat for the Blade and the rally for the Rampage. Am I, like, coming to the right idea with that?
No, yeah, I think it really depends on the circumstance and the team. I think, like, overall, people have tendencies, but a lot of it is so situational dependent. For example, like, if they have both Blade and Rampage, if they Blade, I'm going to beat it, right? I'm going to have to beat it and just pray that we have Shout or Rally for their Rampage afterwards. I think for the support ult specifically, the big one, I think beat for Blade is great. If they don't have Blade, beat for Rampage is also good as well. But I think what makes beat unique, if we just can isolate that one, is it's not just a counter. It's a counter, and then what are you going to do with it?
And that's an engage tool, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because if they Rampage, okay, yes, it counters the Rampage, but you also have temporary HP after that you really ought to be using at that point in time. That's why I think like Beat is probably the more powerful ultimate, and the same thing goes with Blade as well, right? Very rarely do we see a Blade and then a Beat, and then the guy with the Blade just keeps going, right? He keeps chopping with the Blade. No. If you see that Beat, you are out, because you know the team with that Beat is going to be right on top of you in a second's time.
Yeah. I think we've seen Genji's doing better about recognizing that as well. Like at the start of the stage, Genji's were like, fuck it, maybe I can kill this one guy. Like, the Lucio beat it, I'm just going to slash him down 4 times and hope for gold. And then the Genjis just started dying. And then they're like, well, fuck. Now
that's not working at all. Yeah, exactly. Rally is super weird. Rally is like the one where Rally is actually, ironically, is like a really good et cetera ult, I guess I could say. It's pretty good. Oh, that was a nice shot. Sparker's
fucking
so good.
nuts,
Yeah. I think Rally is great at countering Blade if you also have Shout and you all play to counter Blade. Rally can be also good at countering Junker Queen ult if you also have Shout and you play around it. Rally is actually really great at countering a beat engage. That doesn't happen often, but if there is an opportunity for the enemy team to beat engage, Rally is like, all right, you got your temporary HP, we got our temporary HP, but ours lasts longer, so screw you, right? So it's like same thing with like a Sojourn ult as well. If you're able to hard engage into a Sojourn ult with Shout, she's not gonna be able to get a one shot in time. But Rally is like the ult that is really, really tricky if they've got Junker Queen ult if you don't have Shout. Really tricky if you have Blade if you don't have Shout. So it's a really tricky ult to use. I think it's really, really circumstantial.
It's like the most complicated game of rock, paper, scissors you'll ever play, while also having to factor in the fact that the Sojourn could just kill your support off the bat as well.
Exactly.
And that's what makes Overwatch beautiful, right? And that's what makes it great. I actually have another interesting question relative to this, because I actually don't know the answer to this. So Junker Queen supports have gotten really good at just pushing the Junker Queen around when she's trying to rampage. Can you explain to me how the fucking hitbox works with the Rampage? Because it feels like it's a little fucky, and I don't have any understanding. Like, it just seems very inconsistent from what I've seen, but I can't play her to understand it better. Yeah,
so I could give you a little bit of insight, but to be honest with you, there are just as many situations in Overwatch League scrims and games where Overwatch League players are like, what just happened? How did that hit me? Or how did that not hit me? It happens in scrims and games too. It seems to be pretty wonky, but a couple things. One is it definitely seems to have a vertical hitbox as well as a horizontal hitbox. So like if you're on high ground, but the high ground's not very high, it can hit you. So like let's say you're at the top of these stairs, like right here, and you can be hit by a Junker Queen ult, even if it's a little bit below you. So that's some of the weirdness. The other thing that we've noticed is Brig can technically block the ult. Like at least for herself, right, or anybody behind her. It's like a little bit like a sound barrier or anything else where it's like it blocks the application.
Like the LOS of it, right? Like it counts as like an LOS.
Yeah. It's really strange though. It's really difficult to do, and it seems to be a little bit inconsistent. At least we're not good enough to figure it out. But those are some things that you kind of. It's really about like, and a lot of it's also like latency and ping helps or hurts as well. A lot of times where like the supports, everybody's ready to bash out or Sojourn's ready to shift out, and you're like, whoa, there's no way I got hit by that. I totally dodged that, you know.
Yeah.
And you still get hit. So it's a bit wonky.
Okay, so another follow-up of fucky things with Junker Queen. The double shout bug, which has obviously been a thing. I've not talked about as much publicly, but I'm sure internally with the players and the teams, I'm sure it's a big point of contention. How often do you think it's happening? Have you noticed anyone able to replicate it effectively? For what I heard from someone else is that it does happen. It's very difficult to replicate in like an actual game.
Exactly. It's very difficult to replicate because you have to think about like how you're going to be using your shout, whether you're using your shout to kite, or they're using a shot to push. A lot of the times, you're not going to be doing either of those things directly on a corner. You're either going to be past the corner or kiting away from the corner.
Yeah.
And so if you're not able to do that, then it's really, really, really to do. So I'm sure it's been done purposefully in scrims. Maybe somebody was trolling and just wanted to give it a shot. But in an official purposefully, there's no way. Like I would be absolutely shocked. You could probably count the number of times it's actually happened in an official on your thumbs, and then you're gonna count it. It hasn't happened at all purposefully, I would bet.
Yeah, because we saw it. We were watching a VOD yesterday, and I actually saw it happen on proper as he went to take a duel with Sparkle in that duo, and it kind of like actually made a difference. So it is annoying, but it's obviously one of those pain points of playing on a beta version of the game.
I mean, Dallas is just that good, I guess. So
yeah. Okay, so let me throw another curveball question about your Junker Queen. I'm just gonna keep throwing it at you. How do you fix Junker Queen? You're all of a sudden you're Aaron. Obviously, the issue is the temporary instant health that comes in from Junker Queen. Do you think that there's a way to keep the temporary health without keeping her busted in like a brawl meta, or do you think there needs to be altercations that happen?
I think like I've historically like always admitted that I'm not the smartest guy when it comes to like balance ideas. But I think like it's clearly her AoE problem. I don't think it's necessarily the speed. I think the speed is an interesting idea and it's cool, but I do think the temporary HP is too much. I think you could toy with something like 50 temporary HP would feel pretty harsh, but would kind of keep her identity. Again, the problem with it is just that like we're talking about so many metas: double flux support, Winston dive, the Sigma meta like Briggs in. All these metas that are talking about DPS angles and DPS duels and support helping their DPS and taking angles themselves. And now we have a meta where like against everything that's not Junker Queen goats, it's group up as 5 and run them down, right?
Yeah.
It just ignores all, and that's just something that, especially in Overwatch 2, you're not allowed to do that. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. There's no meta or hero that has allowed you to do that, and that comes from Shout.
Yeah.
So it has to be some way of where the temporary HP is good, but it doesn't negate people taking off angles on you, right? You still have to respect those off angles. It has slightly less sustain, something around that affecting that, I think.
Because that was the same thing that happened with Brig in a way, right? Where it's like when she first came in, it was just too much healing. The instant pack was just so oppressive that like it was almost impossible to kill enough people consistently before you just lost the fight.
Right, exactly. I think if you compare like how Junker Queen goats would play up against a Zen meta, would play up against a Pharah meta, and then compare that to Ryan comp with Mei.
Yeah.
It's just night and day, right? Like we do not group up. We had to take angles with Reinhardt. We had to have our soldier flanking, our Cassidy flanking. We had to have Bap Lucio even split sometimes, right? Dueling off angles. But Junker Queen, screw you. We don't care about you. You can have all the high ground you want,
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay, interesting. Okay, let's keep going with the meta while we're here then. Sojourn Ash has been a point of contention for a lot of people. The consensus that most of us have come to is map specific. Situations like this where you're watching Toronto Defiant, they can sit on the high ground, they got those long sight lines, they can get these big kind of dynamites. Is that really like the realistic of it? Or do you think there's a point in which you can just force Ash everywhere if you're good at it?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of the times these, and heck, even the platinum peasants can probably come up with the right answers. I mean, it's really, if you got a good high ground, if you got a good angle, if you can, if like a team like Dallas who's really playing at a high level and is able to kind of keep their Ashe supported and not just die to a solo Genji dash, then yeah, Ashe does a lot of damage, like a lot of damage, way more than Sojourn. I think Bob, in a lot of circumstances, is arguably the more consistent ultimate than Sojourn Railgun as well. It just comes down to, like, first off, does that map require you to move around a lot, right? Like, can you imagine if Sparker was an Ashe right now with the high ground above him? You know, it'd be miserable trying to move constantly, push, pull, in, out, up, down. You know, that would be tough for Ashe, and it's a lot easier for Sojourn. But like you said, with the Toronto, mostly kind of sitting on your heels. You're just kind of sitting, you know, hitting the mouse 1 button. So maybe in that situation, Dynamite's just a lot better. Just the M1 pressure is just that much better.
Yeah.
But I do think, like you said, I think that, like, wrap it up, is like it is team dependent. Dallas is playing it in a lot of circumstances where it doesn't make sense to play it, but they peel so well that it's like the guy just, if he hits his shots, holy cow, he was hitting the shots. The hero's just it's just better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. On that talking, you brought up Dallas. I gotta know who do you have for the tournament? Do you have Dallas or Shock? Because those are really the two big front runners in the West.
I mean, I think
obviously was crazy in that Shock match, but do you think you can keep doing that?
Well, the thing with Shock is, like, obviously that was a huge benefit, or for Dallas, excuse me, it's like a huge benefit when Edison is popping off like that. But I don't actually think the team always relies on that. I think that's what makes them so good, is obviously when it happens, sick. But if it doesn't, Dallas still has so many things to fall back on when it comes to, like, how they approach these, I guess, hive mind sort of metas. So, like, I mean, this is where, like, the intangibles really kick in, right? Season with London, right? Like, how do these teams perform at LAN? How is their training structure? Is anybody just gonna kind of, like, enter that flow state at the right time? And that's where, like, that's what makes Overwatch a little frustrating, because there's always that element of randomness. It's the human element, right? We're not AIs, but it's also what makes it really exciting too, right? I think Dallas should be favored going to this. I think, like, there's a really high chance that they just run away with it. But then there's also a chance that Shock hits a flow state, that, you know, London finds the key and they just destroy everybody. And even a team like Toronto is a team in Scrimbucks as early on, and even in their matches, they were for real, like, the first half of the stage. Obviously it wasn't their day recently, but they were, especially in Scrim, they were terrible, like, in terms of, like, were terrible to play, I guess. Like, they were they were smoking us in scrims, and we were doing pretty well. So you just never know. It really depends. But I think Dallas is, I mean, they're set up for success. Let's put it that way.
It's a great meta for them. You know, we talked about their success being in the hive mind, and with Edison, you're really picking up that hit scan role. I see what you mean, but I don't know. Maybe I'm a Dallas hater. Something about me. I have that feeling of that San Francisco Shock flow state that you said. I can feel it coming in a way that is. It might be scary.
Right.
Sorry, you go.
I was gonna say, I mean, like, I think Shock is, like, a good example of a team that, like us, ironically, when we were playing San Francisco in the double flex support meta, and all of a sudden we've got Backbone and Zen and we're doing all right. I think San Francisco is kind of a similar situation, right? They don't even have, like, a quality main support, and yet they're doing just fine. They're doing absolutely just fine. You know, they're out there pounding. Obviously, it helps when you have proper, but I think it would be disingenuous to say that, like, the coaching staff and all the other players in Shock haven't stepped up a great deal and played really, really well. Like, hey, they took a map off of Dallas, and that game looked competitive, and Edison was popping heads, and Shock was still in there. I think, like, for sure. If Shock hits flow state, Shock could win it.
Okay, so let's talk about the intangibles and bring it back to the London Spitfire. So, like, you talked about how, like, the culture is, like, such a big thing. Is that something that you guys like focused on coming into this season, of, like, hey, we're not gonna be the holy shit, are we gonna get a win in this season, and, like, hey, we're gonna be a competitive team? Like, you said you were doing good in scrims. Did that start early, or did that take a lot of time to get to that point?
It took time. I think it took a lot of patience. I remember the very first talk that Chris had with the team, and it was a real reality check. You know, Chris had come in with, like, hey guys, we're gonna crush the league and we're gonna be the greatest, and we're gonna totally turn it around. He went in with a message of, like, guys, we're a budget team. We're probably going to lose a lot of games, and if you aren't able to find a way to deal with that frustration and deal with the difficulty in scrims and officials, then you just aren't going to belong here. And it was a reality check. I mean, it was tough love, right? It was a reality check of, guys, like, we're going to have to be comfortable with losing if we want to win, I guess would be because it's a long season, right? We can start off bad and improve. The thing is, it's like, are there mechanical players better than our players right now? Yeah, but 6 or 7 months is a long time to improve at Overwatch 2, right? So, and I think, like, over time, like like we talk about like the culture, right? Like Chris was always on it, always keeping on people's toes, encouraging, improving, and then also, a little bit of negative feedback, a little bit of positive feedback, and I mean, really over time, I guess you just start to have people that like really buy into like this is what we're all about. We're the gritty team. We're the ones. I think the Reinhardt one was a really big psychological boon to us because it was like, that's our thing, man. We've got our special little sauce, right? So like there was us and the rest of the league, and we found a way to kind of leverage that into like a psychological advantage because it's like, yeah, we have our own way of playing the game. We don't play by your rules, right?
And that's an important thing as well to go into, right? When you are that team, like we've all seen teams that like, let's say like Paris Eternal this year, for example. It's like they're a team that they had a lot of confidence from last season, but there was almost that level of expectation on them now, right?
Yeah.
It's like they did well last season. Now you guys have to back that up. And all of a sudden they put that pressure on themselves to be like, oh shit, we're not performing that well. You start losing some scrims, you start losing that confidence.
Yeah.
And you see, I'm sure you can speak more to this of like, I remember when I was a player of like, as you can see players losing confidence in their own gameplay as they start losing scrims, as they start losing matches. Like, fans like to act like, oh my God, they're depressed because they lost this match. It's like, no, this person's been depressed for 3 weeks because they've been getting shit on in scrims because they have no confidence in themselves. Like,
100%.
And like, I mean, is that something that you're just trying to like bundle up and make sure that your players are aware of? Like, that's what you said, the Christopher mentality?
Really, yeah. I mean, I think even like London Spitfire last season, I wasn't there for the first 7 months of their training, but I think that was what Paris was this season, right? There's expectation. British Hurricane, they're going to the league. And from what I know, they were doing relatively well in scrims early on. But then, it doesn't quite translate into matches, and then it starts to snowball. And then I think with us, it was the opposite. Like I used to joke that we had the easiest job of anybody early in the season because everybody puts us in last place, and that's every coach's dream.
Yeah.
Because it's like there's no expectations, right? If we lose, okay, everybody's like, all right, sick, It's the real tricky part, like you said, though, is the Paris, right? And for us, it's like, or for London, it was really kind of Hawaii and I guess this stage as well, where now people know that we're not bad, right? So now the expectations are a little higher, and then there's this, and so you really need players that are, one thing I've always said is like better people make better players, and that's where like you have players like the Hotties and the Sparkers and the coaches like Chris that are like just have developed this iron mental and developed this maturity. And so that carries over to officials, right? Like that carries, and that's the thing is like as a coach, can you develop your players to be better, more mature, like more patient humans? Because like that's where the confidence goes. If you're not lazy or you don't have a lot of things that you do besides Overwatch, you haven't really developed as a person, you haven't really developed your character, then the second that adversity hits, you crumble.
Where does that culture come from for London? Because obviously, you guys don't have the budget for like a sports psychologist and a personal trainer and those kind of things that some of these other teams have. But I see you guys posting, like your players posting photos of going to the gym. They always seem to be having a great time. Like, is there a player or is there a coach that's like leading that charge, like promoting that culture?
I mean, obviously, it always starts with your head coach, right? Like he's the one that always. And Chris is a relatively physically active guy. He's very, very confident and kind of exudes like, I got this under control and we're going to be working hard. And so everybody kind of follows suit. But it really is a collaborative effort. I mean, everybody, I'm a big workout guy. I'm big into mental performance. When I was working with him, that was something that I was always working on with the players one-on-one is confidence, mental performance, individual goals. Even things like, this sounds really corny and I won't talk about the player, but one of the players that I was working with, for a period of time, we did nothing but talk about like your job is to take walks and to get sleep, and it was like a daily check-in, like how did you sleep? Were you taking a walk? Were you doing this? And little things like that. It's just like every single player has to be involved in it. Every single player has to kind of buy in, and it doesn't happen immediately, right? Like I think Sparker had an interview with Yiska today, and he was talking a little bit about how like, when I first started, it was just me and Hottie at the gym, and then now there's this player, and then this player, and everybody. And I think that's kind of like what you see, right? Is there's one or two confident players, Chris setting the environment. It doesn't really catch. We win a game. Okay, maybe now there's a little bit more confidence. Maybe there's a little bit less degenerative behavior. A little bit more communication between guys dealing with their problems. one thing that Chris was always like adamant about, even early on in the season, was like bedtimes, right?
Yeah.
We are a very non-degenerate bedtime team. I know we start our day and we are in VOD review at 9 a.m. PST, and those guys are in bed, most of them probably asleep like before 11:30. Which is like crazy for gamers, right?
Yeah,
Like
that's a hard thing to sell.
That is insane. And that was one thing that Chris was like, yeah, we're not bending on tell you on this, you're gonna have to do it. But the rest of the culture, yeah, that kind of came in time.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Like that, like, you know, talking from my experience of someone who has like seen that opposite culture, is like Dallas Fuel 2018 is like the opposite of end of the spectrum of what you guys went through. Of we didn't get predicted last, we got predicted first, and then like I was like, when I signed to that team, I was like, I'm just gonna sit on the bench and I'm just gonna vibe out over here because you guys are gonna do great. And then internally, there was so many issues of like, as you said, players not sleeping enough. We had certain players showing up and they're like, I slept like 2 hours last night, and then they're just like, they're shitty. They don't want to scrim. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to VOD review. Then you have players eating poorly. Like we had a bunch of players who just ate really poorly and they wouldn't want to eat any of the food that was supplied. And then like it really compounds into that kind of like culture, and then it like falls apart for you so quickly because those negative things just go. And like these things can be covered up by winning, right? Like if you're winning, it doesn't matter that some of your players' sleep schedules suck, that you're eating badly, that you're not going to the gym, because you guys are talented enough to win. But the teams that are the best have the best players and they have the correct culture, because that they really feed on top of each other. And then whenever you think of these teams that have like really good players that seem to fail, it usually comes from a management side of they're not treating the players, and they're giving the players what I like to call too much freedom of their choices. Of like, you need a parental figure, you need a hard-hitting head coach who doesn't run it like a boot camp, but respects the players and promotes healthy habits.
Yes, 100%. Like you need a lot of player, and that's where like I think so crucial as well, because I think what you said is like the coach has to set the standard.
Thank you very much for money.
Has to be that parental figure, but it makes your job a million times easier when you've got, even if it's just one respected player kind of setting the standard. And I think that's where like everybody talks about like, you know, Chadi, Chadi. Hadi has been that player really this season consistently. When things are going really poorly, when scrims or people are getting frustrated, when people are degenning it up, Hadi is always setting the good example. Guys, and like he has a tendency to be, he's a very critical guy and a very hard worker. So there's a tendency for players like that to be negative and critical and frustrated. That was something that Hadi struggled with last season, right? I'm putting in so much effort, I'm doing this and this, right? This season, he has improved himself to where he is the guy that's like encouraging, right? He's like, all right, guys, come on, we can do this. Like, always in scrims, always in officials. He's always been that guy. And like, that makes that kind of work as a coaching staff for Chris so much easier. You get one player setting the tempo. Now you got two players. And then now you've got 5 players working out and going. Are you going to be that 6th guy? There's no way, right?
And that's it. Like, especially like, as you said, when you have so many rookies, like you guys have so many like new players, you brought Landon on in the middle of the stage. Like that really is important. Like Landon, I'm sure has just walked in is like, well, everyone's going to the gym. Well, I guess I go to the gym as well. Like it's such a team thing, or like it's such an important thing to have that positive culture. And like you guys, 100%. You can see it in the results of you guys. And
100%.
It's been awesome to see you guys turn it around. I guess this is a hard question for you because you're incredibly biased. But like, talk to me about Christopher, the head coach. Do you think he deserves Coach of the Year? Do you think he has that level of understanding while also providing that team culture that not many other coaches have? Obviously, it's hard to see what other coaches are doing. Yeah. But from your experience.
I think that's the point you just made is like my real misgiving. Like, obviously I'm going to be biased, but I think my major concern is that I'm not there inside the other teams. I'm not seeing those clutch moments when Krusty comes in, or the plan that even just the day-to-day boring that Krusty or Face does that allows their team to be successful. But I will say that having worked with a lot of other coaches, being somewhat familiar with the impact that other coaches have in their team, I think like Chris is really like has to be the front runner. I mean, obviously it does make it easier for us when the expectations were so low that anything feels good. But I think it's not just what Chris did to make us not a dog tier team, right? It was what he's continued to do in transitioning our mindset from no expectations to some expectations to we could be top 4 or top 5 if we're on our game, right? and being able to smoothly like progress with us over the course of the season. I think like even if you compare it to last season's Paris, right? Paris was obviously a team where, you know, get amazed, and a lot of those players really stepped up in a big way. But nobody was going to take Paris seriously as a contender for any stage. And I think there's been situations, not often, but where I felt like we could be at times the best team in the league. Not all the time, not consistently. Not as consistent, obviously, as a team like a Dallas or a Shock or the Gladiators, but there have been glimpses of where we've been playing at a high level, just objectively high level, right? And I think that's where I think Chris really deserves a lot of credit. Is he's been able to deal with the trashy inexperience in it, like low mechanical ceiling team, and then transition that team into something that has continued to grow and continued to improve across metas. I think, to be honest with you, we've improved slightly from meta to meta, which I think is impressive enough alone, right? We're not just the Rhino TPs. Even when we were playing a lot of Rhino, it was percent, right? It wasn't 90%. It was, we had to still play Winston sometimes. We still had to play Ball. We had to play Junker Kumi. We had to play Sigma. We had to play Diva. So I think like that's where I think Chris's like flexibility, and that's where I think his ability to build a team culture, right? Even if we get a bad read on a meta, we still have, I think, a lot more confidence and a lot more discipline than a lot of the teams, I think, and I think that carries over.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. So a lot of people don't really understand what coaches do, like in the league, because it's like, it is a very unique thing. You have 3 coaches, you have a head coach, you have an analytical coach, you have all that kind of stuff. Like, what in your opinion is like an assistant coach? Because we talked about head coaches, they are very culture driven. They obviously they need to understand the game at a high level, but it's they don't need to be that super analytical guy. You're that guy for the team. What do you do for a team like the London Spitfire?
So I can say like a lot of it depends on coach. I think Chris is definitely one of the more strategic leaned coaches that I've worked with. Like he's as good, if not better, than a lot of strategic coaches in the league. He really knows the game well. But from an assistant coach side of things, it's definitely like, it really, I think, is something that you can't like really buttonhole yourself into. You really have to kind of just read the coach, read the individual. I think Commander X is a great example of that, where he is and he's really an analyst. Like that's and we're talking about a league that doesn't really employ analysts, right? Because they just don't have it. But Commander X is really, really, really good at running and finding value out of those numbers. And then you combine that with his excellent strategic coaching knowledge, and we have like a really unique niche in that we're able to just run and read numbers probably better than any team in the league. And so Commander X is kind of an odd one, right? He's a traditional strategic coach or traditional analyst, and he's kind of a hybrid of both. And then I think I kind of fall into a similar category. I have a lot of confidence in my strategic knowledge. Anybody who's familiar with any of my content, I feel like I have a good grasp of the game, period, just on a big macro picture whole. But I also have, I mean, literally 4,000 or 5,000 hours in individual review experience over the past 3 or 4 years. Like I've done so many reviews of every hero. So I did almost all of, about 90% of our one-on-ones. And what I would also often do is like have those one-on-ones tying into what our strategic vision was for the composition that we're playing, so that we're making sure that everybody's on the same page. So I wasn't just a strategic coach, I wasn't just a micro coach, I was actually a one-on-one coach, tying in what the strategy that Commander X or that Chris was coaching into our individual sessions. So it really just depends on the coach, depends on the proficiency, I guess.
Okay, absolutely. That's awesome. I don't know if this is like something that you don't want to say, but like I'm curious on like what your structure was in terms of like how many scrims you'd do a day, how many reviews would you do a day, when would you do them, when are you doing the one-on-ones, like what was your structure? Because every team is different in that regard, and I know some teams do less reviews, some teams like to do more scrims. Like where were you guys at? I
mean, I feel like I can answer this reasonably well. I think for most days, and this is something that was honestly like relative to my, like, I guess quote twit longer, most days we did triple blocks. And I think it's disingenuous to say that that's never a good thing. I think that definitely with the lack of ranked, being able to get a mechanical edge in some ways is definitely something that made a lot of sense. I'm still on a journey myself to decide whether that's like the best thing, but I think like it wasn't an unreasonable decision. But we usually did triple blocks. We start off the day with about a 45-minute review. Sometimes it was 25, but generally that hour block would be filled with team review. And then Sometimes between those 3 blocks, we would do short little team reviews. Sometimes, but that was at most once a day. Sometimes not even at all. Sometimes it would just be that one initial review, be it. So I think that hour between the scrims was usually for break or doing other things, which was good. That kind of compensated a little bit for the difficulty of running triple blocks.
Yeah.
And then in terms of one-on-ones, a lot of that was super meta dependent. So there were times where I would work with a player like Landon 3 times in a week.
Yeah.
Frequently, like 30, 40, usually not long sessions, but 30, 35 minutes. We just go, right? We really were like, okay, this is the goals. Okay, like let's check in what you're doing. Okay, it's looking good. Let's check back in a couple days to see how you're doing. Usually those check-in sessions would be a little faster. Sometimes it would be, it's just really, really short. So I'm gonna record a 10-minute video. I'm gonna send it I had for this map or this matchup. And then, so it was on average, to say at least probably about 1 per player per week on average, usually a little bit more, at least in terms of combining a little bit of feedback sessions with the one-on-one. But then there was also times where, this is like the irony here is like, I'm a firm believer of like, if the player has like full investment and involvement and their own play and they feel like they're really progressing and evolving on their own, don't touch it. I think like a good analogy is that we're not really, I'm trying to think of like, what we are as gardeners, as coaches. That should be the goal. That we are building and nurturing plants. And if the plant is growing healthily, you need to give it space. You need to let it grow. You need to let them take responsibility. So, ironically, 2 of our star players and are the Rhine meta, especially the first and Backbone and Hottie, right? Backbone's May. Whoa, Hottie's Rhine. I coach those guys the least out of all of the players one-on-one. And it was because they were so individually invested in their own goals and the own things they're working on. They're doing their self-review. They're like, all right, I'm gonna try this, or they don't need me. They don't need me. I mean, if they're stuck or there's something that I feel like they're underperforming at, then I would take time and go, okay, I think, for example, there's a period of time where I think Backbone was getting really, really low value on Blizzard. And so I looked into it, right? And it was, honestly, the answer was really simple. It was just, you needed to do a little bit more preparation between fights and thinking ahead of time and communicating a little bit better, right? But for the most part, those 2 guys, just let them be. They were hard workers. They were smart guys. They were constantly doing their own thing. And the same thing with Landon. Sometimes with Landon, he'd be a meta he's really struggling with, and I'd work with him a lot, give him a lot of, mostly, honestly, a lot of support for what he's doing, right? You're doing fine, just hang in there, you're doing. And then once he gets to a point where he's comfortable and he feels like he's progressing, let him handle and take responsibility for his own play at that point.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because like every player is different, right? Because like even from like my experience,
100%.
like I am someone who I love reviews and I love someone coming to me and like talking to me about feedback because it's actually interesting because I've actually seen this characteristic in players when I watch their streams, and I don't know if you've seen the same thing, but there are players who they will just play ranked, but they will individually push themselves to do different things time and time again. Yep. I am not one of those players. I will go through the motions, I will think about it, and I'll go through the motions, but I need someone to tell me if I'm doing something wrong because I have like blinders on. I'm not thinking about other ways to think about it unless I take a step back, do a personal review, have someone else bring in a different perspective. And I think that's sort of what you're saying there, right? Like Backbone and Hottie, they understand how to push the limits, how to try new things, how to test things out. But not every player is like that. So players need different levels of feedback.
100%. And it's dependent on hero as well. I think Sparker is definitely a player who I worked with a pretty decent amount over the course of the season, who I'll constantly need to give him a kick in the pants. But he was also a player who, once I gave him the first couple initial reviews, like, hey, I don't know what's doing, turn your brain on, like, let your cooldown usage here, like, let's try this. Then he's a type of player that, especially as the season progressed, where he got to a point with his own intelligence, with his own, like, I guess, character, to where he just needed less and less, I guess, as the stage would go on. And then we'd start over again, and I'd give him another kick in the pants, then he was good to go for the rest of the stage. And like you said, every player is different, and it's about kind of getting, not just like telling the player what to do, but also like you really got to get to know the players. The most effective reviews I have are with the people that I know the best. And that's the dichotomy of a coach, right? Is you don't necessarily aren't always their friend, but you got to know them. You got to know them as people. You got to care for them. Otherwise, you're just not going to be an effective coach.
And they're not going to take what you have to say like
exactly.
Legitimate. Like how did you deal? Like, did you ever deal with this, or how do you overcome this issue of like the idea that pro players, they're better than we are, right? Like they understand the game at a way higher level. How do you give effective coaching? Like, is it more about you making them question themselves, or is it about you just throwing out ideas that provoke thought? Like, how do you like to do that level of coaching?
So, I mean, it helps a lot when you have a little bit of a reputation going in. I remember when I first, huge problem, right? People didn't know who I was. Like, were you just some random dude, you know? But as time goes on, like, oh yeah, Spilo, he knows what he's talking about. That's fine. But even then, I try to not assume that I have the buy-in. I try and build that camaraderie. I try and build that trust. I actually remember the very first review I ever did with Admiral Raptor, back when he was still Admiral Raptor. Was before we just picked him up. I don't even know if he was announced. Build a little bit of like relationship, playing Overwatch 1 ranked, and it was on Eichenwald, and the entire review on his was me asking questions. I literally went into the review, I was like, hey, I just want to look at this review, and I want to just kind of, all I'm going to do is ask questions, and it's not passive aggressive, not trying to imply anything, I'm just going to ask questions. So we'd start the review, we'd go look at the team fight, and then I'd just say, hey, you're playing Baptiste, was there a better position than where you held? Was there did you use your shift the best that you possibly could? And then he would say, well, yeah, I think it did. And then we'd end up discussing the shift, used to discuss the positioning. And then we did that over and over and over, and it was a little bit tedious, like 40 minutes in, and then I just said, all right, that's it, we're done. And then I said, okay, you tell me, after we've been through all of these team fights, what do you need to improve on? Because we've been over like the details of every fight, could you position better here, could you shift better here? What's the takeaway here? And I remember the takeaway at the time was he needed to be a little bit more proactive with shooting out DPS, shooting out tanks and angles, like a little bit more like positioning himself in a way to where he was kind of more preventively protecting himself rather than reactively just standing in one spot. But I didn't tell him that, right? I would ask pointed questions because I would see things that would, but I wanted him to come to that and then come to that conclusion. Because if he comes up with that idea, if he comes up with that, then that's going to stick so much better than anything that I could ever possibly say. And especially because, you know, I didn't have that buy-in. I didn't really know him, experience coaching him. That was how I needed to coach him for that situation. And I think, like, as time goes on, I built more camaraderie with Admiral. And he's a pretty smart guy, so usually didn't. But as the course of the season went along, there was a couple, this sucks, I really think you should try this, and you'd be like, okay, you know, but like
you gotta build to that, right? You can't start with it. This sucks.
You gotta build to that, and even when you get to that point, for a lot of players, that's not where you want to be. Sometimes it's just like being roasted a little bit, and they're cool with it. But sometimes, you know, like a player like Admiral, he's a really smart guy, and he puts a lot of thought into his play. So even then, that was a rarity with Admiral. Even when I did build that trust, usually it was more like I've been thinking about this. What do you think, right? And if nothing else, we come to a conclusion. So. I think that's the key thing. Where like other players, like Sparker, I could just tell him, you know, you're being an idiot. What are you doing here? And he'd laugh about it. He'd think it's funny, and then, you know, we'd figure it out. You know, it just depends on the player.
Yeah, and that's it about like understanding what players want. It's funny because like I literally draw parallels to mine with Packing. Like when Packing first joined the LA Valiant in 2019. His first job was to be like, whoa, what the fuck is Custa doing on Lucio? So he came into me and he walked me through it, like step by step of like, you know, and one of the big things that I came out with our first reviews is that my amp timings are just wrong, like not wrong, but you don't realize how. And like anytime I talk to someone and they ask me about Lucio tips, I'd be like, just go back and look at when you press that button, because you'll realize you're pressing it a couple of seconds early, a couple of seconds late, or you didn't need to press that button at all, and like you learn from that. And it's funny as well because Packing is one of those people, and me and Packing have a relationship where it's like he just straight up says I'm doing shit wrong, and like from time to time, and he's like, like he makes me question myself, but as well, like he's not afraid, and that's who I am. Of like, I don't care if you tell me I'm doing it wrong, as long as you have legitimacy and authenticity to what you're saying. I'll listen, right? As long as you're not wrong and you're coming in with the wrong opinion and I can't back up why, like that's where the problem comes. And I think there's a lot of bad coaches out there that exist in Overwatch. I think less so now. A lot of them have been filtered out, but there's a lot of. The biggest thing that I would say if you're an aspiring coach or that kind of stuff, and you've sort of laid this out perfectly, it's about helping the players come to their own conclusions in a lot of ways, because that's what's going to stick with them. You know, one of the big ones that I think really stands out in my mind that I think got overhyped in the past was like the JMac essay that he wrote for the Paris Eternal players, and I said this when it first came out, I'm like, it's not always a great way of coaching. You can tell someone, you can give them a laundry list of things that they're doing wrong, unless they really understand that the reasoning of the why and how to, and coming to the conclusion and recognizing themselves, it's so hard to work with that and fix those mistakes.
Well, you talked about it earlier. You talked about in that one forget the coach's name, Damien, where it's like it's just too much to process. There's just no possible way you can process that. Like the human brain learns through processes called like chunking, right? Where people see patterns, right? And they're able to kind of memorize this plus that. But that takes time. That takes a lot of time. And no commentary on J-Mech or his current coaching. I know those guys are dealing with a lot of adversity. But the essay isn't coaching. That is information. It is a lot of times the players might already have what they personally need to execute, or even the way they're thinking about it. Like you said, the amp thing. Maybe it wasn't a lack of understanding on your part. It was just a lack of focus at key moments, right? Yeah. And I think that's such a crucial part of coaching. And to be honest with you, that I think was like my biggest disappointment about the season, and with the situation that I was in with my family, with my house, with being married, and all the stuff I talk about Twit longer. Like, I think that was the biggest disappointment. Was like when you aren't there in person, you're just not as good. You're just at least at that aspect of coaching, which is so important. It's like I think I did pretty well, all things considered. But it's just not as good. It's just if we're honest and frank with ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so we're going into the final map here.
Sure.
As we continue this on, London's up 2-1. Let me get your thoughts. Like, what was
Sure.
London Spitfire? They're coming into this meta. You guys were a little shaky. Let's sort of go back to the game a little bit. So, how confident? Like, obviously, it's been a couple of weeks since you've been there. Like, how confident were you guys in this meta? And what is the expectations for London Spitfire for this tournament? Are they trying to get like a top 4, or are they just trying to get like a top 6? Do they just want to have fun? Are they just trying to get a free holiday? Like, that's what Goomba said for the Mayhem.
Yeah, I think with all honesty, I think top 4, anything but top would be disappointment for the boys. Okay. I mean, there is a world where they they don't make top very easily. But I think, especially for the caliber of like expectations that we have for ourselves and the work that they put in, not top 4 placement would be disappointing. I think you could make an argument that in terms of some teams, maybe mechanically we're not always 100% top 4, but I think like we're gonna be frustrated if we're not top 4 for sure. 100%.
So the backbone. Let's talk about Backbone a little bit, because he's a player that, like, I didn't really know much about anything when he was coming into the league. Obviously, he had that super comment in after his first game, which I'm sure was like hard for him. Like, that's a hard narrative to shake when you've done that. Like, his Mei, honestly, I think is one of the best in the world from just like watching it consistently. And his Genji has made leaps and bounds of improvement. Like, talk me through Backbone. How has he done such a good job of improving, especially on that Genji?
Sure. I mean, I've talked about this. Like, Backbone historically, back in Contenders, was a very, very, very flexible player. Like, he was good in a lot of years. And then just went through a tough time, wasn't able to play in scrims for a long period of time. And then obviously picked up. And then, we play a lot of Mei. He's not able to show his, flex his muscles a lot in a lot of different aspects. So then you get put in a situation where, like, you just haven't played the hero in literally ages, right? Yeah. And then obviously, like, you have the meme, and then everybody's talking about the meme, and like, that's tough on your confidence. Like you said, like, that's one thing that is such a curse when it comes to being a professional esports player. Is you are very accessible to these memes, you know these things, who's memeing about you. And I think for Backbone, clearly mechanically he wasn't at the peak, but I think people slept on him, and I've even talked, especially when he put a couple of extra weeks of work into it. I mean, there were scrims where, I think, again, Yiska's interview with Spark talked about this today, where Backbone was playing at Proper's level, like, mechanically, right? Yeah. But it's the flow state that he has to get into. It's that confidence that he has to have in himself. And especially when, people are doubting you or the team is struggling, you don't get there. You don't get there. And I think one of the things that this brings up a really great talking point about not just Backbone, because I think this is what makes players like Kevster and Proper so great, is not just that they have these crazy high mechanical peaks, because I think their peaks are high, but I think that you look at so many Genjis in the league, when they're playing in a flow state, the gap is very, very, very small.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
But what makes them great is that they're just so consistently good, Maybe Proper's not like literally like hitting every shuriken, but he's like, how many bad games has Proper had this season? How many bad games has Kevster? Even this stage, how many bad games has Kevster?
He was like a top 4 Genji, like, statistically, even though his team went like tragically bad.
And I think you were talking about Kai on stream earlier. I was chiming in.
Thank you very much for
turning my stream on, and it's the same thing. It's like, that to me is the real caliber of a true player, and I think like that's what Backbone's path has been like, can I not just play Genji at a peak level in scrims? Oh, I'm diffing Proper. Oh man, but can I do that in an official? And then can I do that again? And then can I do that again? And then can I do that again? And that's like his own personal path, right? And something that he has to improve on as an individual, because, you know, he's had some really ugly valleys this season, you know, and he would admit it as well. He's played like trash at points, not just on Genji. There was a map, I don't doubt you guys, people even remember it, but King's Row versus Gladiators, the game we lost 3-1. We should have won that game. That map 2 or 3, I think, was on King's Row. We lost very narrowly. I don't think he hit a shuriken in like 45, or shuriken, I say, an ice goal in like 45 seconds in May. He just whiffed every single one. The pressure was high, and he choked, and he looked real bad. But I think what he's done is, and hope will continue to do, is he's been building the confidence, right? He's been, like we talked about it earlier, developing that character, developing that player, just developing himself as a person, and that will help him hit more shurikens as Genji. As crazy as that sounds, that's just how life works. And that's like been his goal this season.
Do you think that's like one of the most underrated aspects of a player is just confidence? I know a lot of average 100%. Players who just outperform themselves due to just unreasonable confidence in themselves, and that's the thing, as you said about Proper. Like, you just watch Proper play the game, and like the way he moves around, like he plays as if he's never gonna miss, and then he never does miss because he just plays in that state.
100%.
Like, I think everyone who's ever played Overwatch can say, like, you know, that when tensions get high, you hit that overtime, all of a sudden the adrenaline starts flowing. It's so easy to get in your head. You miss a couple of shots, all of a sudden you start losing that confidence. Like, is that something that you've seen, like, that London Spitfire has had any issues with this season, of just like you had one or multiple players lose confidence in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that every team struggles with in any sport. I mean, I think everybody, even if you don't compete in Overwatch, if you've played a game, or you've played a video game, or you've played even just a sport, flow state is very real, and it allows you to play better mechanically. Like, when you start thinking too much, you start playing worse. And I know that sounds different, but when the game, especially of Overwatch, is just too fast and too complicated for you to be thinking. You just have to flow, you just have to feel. And so when you lose that confidence and you start thinking the confidence, you start slowing down. And like you said, it is really an underrated skill. It is really an underrated skill. I think I think the NA Hive Mind, the joke about like the Atlanta Reign in seasons past, like that team performed really well when it was confident. Even though, because for whatever reason, I don't know if it's just NA ego, those guys just occasionally hit these flow states where they just believe that they were the best, you know? And all of a sudden they start overperforming, and like they're in grand finals against Shanghai Dragons. Like, obviously there's a lot of factors that goes into that, right? But like, I think that was a crucial one. And again, like, look at a team like the Glads. Like, Glads just, they get on LAN and they're just like, the ego comes out and they just don't care. And you're gonna play well. You're gonna play well with that. Now there are downsides. Too much ego can cause a lot of other issues external, but I think there is lack of confidence is 100% something that hurts and hinders players.
Yeah, and it's actually, you know, I reference this a lot of times, but it's funny because in 2018, I remember when I was on the Dallas field, Johnny wrote this article, reinforced, like, it was about the Dallas field, and he was saying it was like this mentality of playing to win instead of playing to not lose. And I think a lot of teams and players get into this mentality a lot of the time, where it's like they're so worried about losing that they're not thinking about how they win the game.
100%.
And they start playing in a way that, yes, maybe they're not feeding in the lobby, but they're all of a sudden leaving their teammates out to dry, and then all of a sudden teammates lose confidence in each other, and that's how you generally see these implosions of these teams. And that all goes back to that confidence aspect that we were saying.
Right. And it's hard to get back to. You know, it is an ethereal thing to hold on to. When we beat the Reign ending stage 1, right, on that call, that was the one thing Chris said. He's like, guys, do not play to not lose, play to win, right? Yeah. Don't be scared to make mistakes. Let's finish this out with some balls. And I think that we did.
And that's the important thing. All right, so as we're coming into the closing stages, I got a couple more questions. These are more just like short form, you know, punchline questions that always come through. Right now, who's your MVP of the league?
Kevster, I think. I know that's a bit of a hot take.
Ooh.
I think Kevster has just been consistently the most, like, really just the most consistent player throughout the season. He just doesn't have a bad game. I think Glads don't win either stage without Kevster.
Yeah, I believe. I think Kev's is a good shout. I'm personally a Proper fan, as much as they haven't got over the edge. Like, I think Proper is the best player in every server he's ever been, even when Kevster was in it. Like, you know, you look at that mid-season. But I respect it. I respect it. Okay. Follow up. I want you to sell me and my chat on the London Spitfire. Why should we be fans of your team? What is the peaks that you guys can get to? Not just this stage, but next stage. How are you guys going to make a playoff run?
I think, like, just if nothing else, like, you know that we're going to be giving effort, and you know that we're going to be authentic. Like, we're not always going to follow the meta. We're not always going to be good. We're not the traditionally strong team with a massive roster. Like, the underdog, I guess, team. I mean, that's what we are. Like, the meme exists, you know, from the coaching and the hard-working, grinding players that nobody does. Like, we really are, like, that is exactly what the London Spit. We've had our moments, but, like, it's a lot of our wins this season have and I think, like, if you want to root for an underdog, a team that, like, really has good attitudes, has put the work in, and honestly has a lot of character as well. I think if you look, has, like, Hottie, like, you know, Backbone, like Landon, and really everybody, Poco as well. Got a lot of character, you know. We got guys with personalities, we got guys with confidence, and they're good guys too, right? We're not just, you know, arrogant buttholes, but these guys are genuinely good guys, they're good teammates, they care a lot, they're good people, and I think, like, that's something to root for. And I know there's a lot of drama going on in the league, but I think for the players and the staff, they're good guys. Nuki, Commander X, Chris, they're good guys, good team, underdogs, and yeah, you should be a fan if you aren't already.
Oh, hell yeah. Okay, last question. Next meta, what do you think it's going to be? Let's just go off the idea that Junker Queen gets thrown off a cliff, right? Like, what do you think the next meta is? Because we still got the Doomfist nerfs, we got the Orisa buffs, we got a bunch of things that came through.
Man, it's tough. I mean, it really is going to depend on strong, because I imagine nerfs. I imagine there's going to be a little tweak here, a little tweak there, and I think what they're tweaking is going to be crucial. We're going to go back to some form of mobility, I think. I think you'll probably see, maybe, are we going to see Tracer again? Are we going to see Zenyatta again? Because I think one of Zenyatta's big strengths wasn't just the HP, but the fact that I can orb my flankers, right? We can play for map control.
And the kick is such a nice thing in these dive
It really
heroes,
is.
Right? Like,
huge survivability. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like, we could see Doom come back if they revert that slow nerf on his slam. But a lot more mobility, I think, in terms of, and by mobility, I don't just mean speed. I mean ability to just kind of be in a million different places at once. Maybe Genji, maybe Tracer. It's really too early to say, but I think moving away from the stacked up, group up, run people over with, you know, dribble on your mouth. If they nerf Junker Queen, that's going to be gone.
And London Spitfire will still play Reinhardt no matter where it ends up, I'm sure.
100%.
Spilo, that's it for this one. Thank you very much so much for joining me and giving the insight. Like, honestly, your answers were awesome, super insightful. I know chat's been saying how awesome this has been as well, so I really appreciate you coming on. Let people know where they can find you. I know you've been making a lot of content. You do a lot of coaching stuff. How do they find out your content?
Sure, I appreciate you having me on. First of all, you can find me on twitch.tv/Spilo, Spilo. You can find me the same, I believe, Twitter, coach_Spilo. You can join my Discord from either of those links. But yeah, I've been doing some private coaching and trying to get a little bit of the Overwatch content wave going into Overwatch 2. Hope it goes well. But yeah, thank you again so much for having me on. Your stuff on the desk and all that stuff. I think you're the greatest. And yeah, have a good rest of your day, sir.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for watching this YouTube video, and I will see you guys next time.